Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I've had a lot of Swedish colleagues over the years, so finally, when they ask me the awkward question, have you been to Sweden, I can say yes. That's awesome. So, as the kind introducers have said, my name is Mala, and I am a UX and UI designer at the United Nations Children's Fund, more commonly known as UNICEF. And I know some of you are probably thinking, a designer at the United Nations? That sounds like an oxymoron, and mostly you are correct. There are not a lot of us. There's like 5 in the world. But over the years in my kind of intersection of tech and design and international development, I've honed in on a concept that I call substantive tech, which is essentially designing for the world's toughest problems. And thinking about how to kind of encapsulate that idea, I picked out this photo. This is of a health center in West Africa, just outside of Accra, Ghana. And it is probably one of the best health centers I've ever seen in sub-Saharan Africa. And not surprisingly, you see the woman who heads the health centers holding a tablet. Digital tech has a huge, huge capacity to transform many different industries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And today I'm going to give you some of those examples. Okay, as a starter, I want everybody to think about a simple question. How much money did you spend on your phone? If you're like me and you think in US dollars, you're probably thinking maybe $500, $600, all the way up to $1,000, $1,200 if you want the most expensive phone on the market. Or maybe you're thinking in terms of like a monthly installment, like $80 a month. Interestingly, when you ask this question to people across sub-Saharan Africa, you get a very different response, and this is the reason why. So if you look at this chart, in these yellowish, orangey dots, you've got the iPhone retail price when it launched. So all the way starting at the original, around $800 for an unlocked phone, not tied to any plan, all the way up to the iPhone X, which retailed at about $1,100. And then in these blue bars here, you've got the 15 lowest GDP per capitas. And if you're not familiar with the term, essentially that is how much money does the average worker in a country make per year. And so looking at the contrast between the two, you can understand why you get a different response. Because if you were the average person working in the West African country of Niger, not Nigeria, if you were the average Nigerian, you would have spent 46% of your annual income on the iPhone 5C, which is the cheapest one that Apple ever launched. If you made as much as the average Gambian, you would have spent 65% of your annual income on an iPhone X. And if you made as much as the average Burundian, you would have spent 93% of your annual income on the iPhone 3S, which was about the same as a lot of the other models that came out. And so when you think about these numbers in that term as a percentage of the total amount of money you make per year, it's not controversial to say that digital design these days is for the rich. It's not for the need. These are where most of the designers live, and these are the countries where they can have the most impact in terms of human development. So how we can alleviate poverty, how we can help achieve human rights, how we can do the things that actually make our societies possible. We see this all the time in many different ways throughout the industries. 2 common expressions we see all the time in tech and design are solving problems and then having adventures. Everybody likes to have an adventure. But when you look at the actual problems that some companies are solving, you get kind of a ridiculous picture. These are, granted I took some extreme examples, but these are some venture capital-backed companies and the statements that they were trying to solve for. Customers can't control their fruit juicers from their phone. Customers who need to buy toilet paper at 2 a.m. have the inconvenience of having to talk to somebody at a convenience store. It's so hard. And then customers currently cannot commute to work by helicopter taxi. These companies got more money than some people make in their entire life. And then everything is having an adventure. Going for a hike, eating dinner, driving to work, like everything's an adventure, right? By contrast, these are the things that we deal with in international development. More than half of the children in the world are born into poverty. There are millions of refugees and internally displaced people as a result of civil war and unrest. And most, if not all countries, arguably most countries, if not all countries, treat women as second-class citizens. Fortunately, despite all the crazy things I've done in this world, we don't use this term in international development, having adventures. Look, there is nothing wrong with being passionate about dinner. I love dinner. In fact, I love dinner so much that sometimes I have it twice in one day. But to say that these are the toughest problems that design can solve is not true. There is so much good that we can do in this world. And so in a few minutes, I'm going to give you some examples of how design can actually impact the world. All right, so to kind of sum up this entire level of thinking, or this entire frame of mind, in 2016, I had the great privilege of working with some brilliant technologists, and we came up with two theses about the tech industry and the design industry as a whole. The first is that a deep understanding of superficial problems overshadows substantive problems being addressed, so exactly what I was talking about before. And the second is that a lot of companies and people who start out dealing with these problems and then realize that they're bigger things in the world will often go into these substantive tech solutions, but they don't understand anything about the context. They've never been to the country, they don't speak the language, they don't know anything about the culture. They go in there and they try to use the exact same process that they use in the Western world, and then they don't know anything about on the ground. So in the project, I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested. We did a lot of cool stuff, like we built this VR experience that kind of looked at the second statement. The entire project was a total satire. And what we had people do is, using an app, they could customize a pump and then solve Africa's water problem. So we just kind of threw the parts in a VR experience in the middle of the desert, and people built a pump, and they could do dumb things like, making the water spurt out, and you see this one, Ghana green is the most popular color, because that's what's important, it's the color of the pipe. Okay. So what are examples in design in which we use a deep understanding of a substantive problem to inform a substantive solution? For the first example, I'm going to take you to a West African country called Mali. Great country, super friendly, really hot, be prepared. So we looked at a project in the middle of Mali in Sugoi. And the problem statement was this: like in most countries in the world, youth don't participate in local politics. And so politicians have basically no information whatsoever on how they can actually help people who are young in Mali. So we had kind of a two-tiered approach. The first is they could send questions to Malitel, one of the local telecom providers, and ask questions about how your taxes are used, or why is it important for me to participate in government, what do you actually do for me, kind of thing. And then the second thing that we did was we created an app that would allow them to interface with politicians in kind of an indirect way, but that laid the groundwork. And so what we did was we took villages and we grouped them into 2 to 4, and then we assigned each of them into a jeune leader, a young leader. And so the young leader would go around these villages and ask questions to people and say, like, what are the important issues to you? What do you think needs to change in our society? They would fill out these reports, and then they would send them back to an aggregation system, and then we would help them come up with the final report that we then sent to the local politicians. And so the local politicians could either act on it through legislation, or they could do marketing campaigns or media campaigns to kind of help people understand what was actually being done in the world. And my job was to design the app. So the app itself had to be super straightforward, had to have a lot of redundancies. We ended up making it basically look like a checklist, because the most important thing was to make sure that people understood, the jeunes leaders who were going out, understood what exactly they were supposed to do. Even though the reports itself were saved on their local device, we had feedback loops like, your last save was 10 minutes ago, and then we also created redundancies, and not only having the checklist, but also the bottom nav. The heart of the entire thing, of course, was this report, and one of the things that I have learned over the years is not just with youth in Mali, but youth pretty much anywhere. A lot of them think that every word is important, everything is a really important concept. So we actually took out rich text editors and we just put in very simple stylizations so that every single word was italicized and bold and underlined, because then you get a report that's basically unreadable. So super straightforward, a lot of ways that you could go back and navigate through, but everything really centered around this report, because this was the crux of everything. This is what we needed to get for the information so that the politicians knew how to act. But then, as it often goes, a young teenage woman showed me the errors of my way. She told me that, my app needed work. That was her actual words. And my favorite question to people in the field, or when I'm doing this kind of work, what is the app that you use? Because often it's not intuitive why a certain app like Uber or WhatsApp becomes globally popular, whereas another app that seems more intuitive doesn't. And she told me the reason why WhatsApp actually became so popular is this little thing here, this microphone. It's because so many people in the field, in these countries, don't speak in the lingua franca. They don't speak in English, they don't speak in French or Portuguese, they speak in a local language. So then translating what they say into a text report doesn't make any sense. And then culturally, sitting on a phone has a much more significant impact than it does here in the States. I might think you're rude if you're looking at your phone while I'm talking to you, but I'm not going to stop being your friend. But if you go to the villages of Sugoi, Mali, no, people are not going to look at you twice. So she told me that we basically needed to redo everything that we had and orient everything around voice, which is exactly what we did. So taking out this old version of having the report, the text report being the center of everything, we switched it out to be a voice recorder, because like a dictaphone had been around for 50, 60 years in Mali, the text report actually was a fairly new thing for them to understand. And in doing that, we actually got great results. We had higher response rates, we had more meaningful answers, and overall we had fewer errors. And the political participation of the country went up. Okay, so for the second example, how many of you remember the SMS? I remember, right, like 5 of you. There's a reason why. Like 15 years ago, I went to dinner with one of my friends, and she looked at me and she's like, Mala, I'm really mad because you haven't answered any of my text messages. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. What's an SMS? Like, it was a new technology. No one really used it. But then within a couple years, Facebook launched a direct messaging app, and then Instagram added one, LinkedIn, Twitter, Pinterest, basically everything, right? So like these days, I maybe send 2 actual text messages a week, but I might send like 1,000 WhatsApps, or I might send 100 iMessages. Like, there's so many different ways to communicate that the text messages become kind of obsolete. And when we see it as a percentage of the total breakdown of digital tech in Western societies and higher economically developing countries, it's reflected in there. A lot of what we do is responsive web, a lot of what we do are smartphone apps. Wearables are increasing every single year, but then as a proportion of what we design, SMSs are going down overall. They may be integrated in our app, maybe somebody can sign up to get a text alert, but it's not the core of what we're designing for. But then when you go to least economically developing countries, you see the opposite. SMS is still king. The majority of the information passed in sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of South Asia is through text message. And while it may interface with smartphone apps, and while you may have smartphone apps that are native, so to speak, in that part of the world, it's not nearly as big as it is here. And then, because a lot of people don't have a computer, responsive web is a thing, but it's not nearly as big. And then there are some projects every now and then with wearables. It's really not significant. It's not even significant to put it on this chart. Okay, so the next example, if you remember on that chart, that country of Burundi, where you would spend 93% of your annual income, that's the next example. So it's a tiny country, so small I had to zoom in twice into the map. And those are the hills leading up to the center of the country. So thank you, UNICEF, for these amazing photos of health centers in Burundi. The problem statement that I was dealing with, the project that I was leading there, was that Burundi has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. So what that means is, in Burundi, if you are a pregnant woman giving birth, you are more likely to die as a direct result of complications to your birth than you are in pretty much any other country in the world. And on top of that, there's limited supplies, there's limited resources to actually alleviate the strain. And so my job is to go in there and figure out how this great old SMS can actually improve the situation. So everything we did in Burundi was kind of oriented in 2 ways. It's whether it was an emergency or whether it was not. And if it was an emergency, then what we did was we started something called a flow. So let's say that I'm a health worker in the middle of Burundi, and I have a woman who comes into my health center, and she's got heart palpitations. And I'm not sure if it's something very serious, or she just needs a break. And giving birth is a strenuous activity, so maybe she just needs some time. Maybe she needs to go to the proper hospital in the center of the country. I don't know. So what I could do is then I could open up a flow, which is basically a series of questions that would then connect me to somebody in a health center, and they could make a diagnosis, or they could say that we need emergency equipment sent. Some of you are probably thinking, well, if she's got heart palpitations and she's giving birth, then of course you send her to the hospital, duh, like why wouldn't you? But remember, this is a resource-poor country, and every single time you send an ambulance to some place, that means you can't send it somewhere else. And if there's only 5 ambulances in the entire region of the country, you have to be very smart in your decisions. So you have to figure out what is actually important before you allocate any of your resources. And so this flow was a really great way to figure out what is the intervention needed, or what is the diagnosis that could possibly be made. Then on the flip side, we have campaigns, which in some cases are a series of events, like you could go to an event maybe about, birthing or something. Or in more often cases, let's say that you're the woman, and thankfully you came out alive and your baby is fine. And now, according to international standards with the World Health Organization and with UNICEF, you have to go to 5 postpartum visits after you give birth. And so we could sign up women for a campaign that would essentially say, every 3 weeks after you give birth to your baby for 15 weeks, you need to go to this local health center and do a check-in. So it would basically send her reminders. And then from that, we could aggregate the data, and we could figure out what the trends are, what's actually working, and what's not. And so what we would do is we would use an SMS aggregator, so you basically build out a flow or a campaign. You could have data checks, like if somebody said that they're 5,000 years old, you send them back to the beginning of the flow. So they would lead all the way through the actual flow, and hopefully at the end they would get the information that they needed. Okay. In some cases, building out a flow is actually pretty easy. When you go to the paper-based system in Burundi and you see something like this is basically a flow chart, right? So you know exactly how to structure the flow. And in other cases, you've got things like maps, which is fairly straightforward. If you ask somebody where they live, we can turn this into a digital version, and then we say, okay, they are in Bungari, that health center, so we need to send the ambulance closest by. But in other cases, it's not so straightforward. And this is my colleague from the Ministry of Health in Burundi looking very sad, because all of that stuff behind him are the actual patient records. They're the actual logs and registers that have the equipment written down. So the entire history of the health center is behind him in all of those dusty old books. And trying to figure out how to translate that into this is really difficult. So one of the things that's great about UX design and so many research methodologies is that it helps us with prioritization. And so when we started out with 13 indicators, trying to figure out where do we go first, where do we prioritize first, we did a prioritization exercise. We looked at the 2 things that we needed to evaluate, which is it a high or low cause of death? And can the equipment that we have actually better the situation? Because the last thing we want to do is work on something that may not actually be as big of a problem as something else, or work on something that we just can't change with what we have. And so when we plotted out all of the indicators, it turned out we had 3 that fell squarely into this thing. And by the Moscow methodology, the must, should, coulds, and won'ts, these were the musts. This is where we start. And it was a great exercise, and it framed the entire thing that we did. And it took this whole mess of information and boiled it down into something much more tenable. Right. So over the years, I've worked a lot in the field across sub-Saharan Africa, but I've also worked with different parts of the United Nations. And one of the great things about design is that we can work for organizational capacity. Because in all honesty, tech is transformative, but it's not going to be the problem solver of poverty and human rights. It's not going to be the one singular thing that does it, but it can help facilitate. And so part of what we can do is to help organizations that do the core of that work do what they do better. And so I have a couple of design victories, if you will, of things that I've done for different UN organizations and other organizations to kind of help along the way. One of the examples up here is for UNICEF Innocenti. They are the research arm of UNICEF. So if I wanted to know if a randomized controlled trial worked in this country, would it work in this country, I could go to Innocenti and ask them, what research do you have? And they would come back and tell me. And they wanted to create a hallmark research product called an evidence gap map, which is basically like a glorified matrix. So if I wanted to see an outcome and I wanted to see an intervention, I could look at the intersection. That's all the evidence and studies that exist there. So when I was tasked to design the online version, the first thing I did was look at other evidence gap maps, and it turned out every single one had these weird bubbles for some reason. So it's hard to see on this, but that gray bubble there represents 70 studies, and all the dots surrounding it represent 5. So it's not proportional representation. But then when I spoke to people who would actually use the evidence gap map, I ended up switching the design from bubbles to bars, because it turns out, yeah, the primary purpose is to see an absence of literature, but it also turns out the secondary purpose is to see the relative amount of literature. And so that proportional representation was hugely useful, and what I consider a design victory. The second example is pretty straightforward. I managed the Alliance Française of Washington, D.C. For a separate job. They did a complete website redesign, and I was the lead designer on a lot of components. They wanted to do a placement test, and they said everything is multiple choice, but having learned a foreign language myself, French specifically, we decided to go ahead and code up all of the different question types. So we mocked it up and had a very clear picture to the developers. This is what ultimately you need to design, even though your requirements were much, much fewer. And then for pretty much every job ever, just having really well researched and presented evidence is incredibly useful. Social justice organizations know about evidence and they know about research, but they know about it for the program. They know about it for the specific intervention that they're doing. They can tell you the stats of the country, they can tell you about the culture, they can tell you probably why the war was started, why it ended, they can tell you who was affected and why, but they can't necessarily tell you how to do that when applied to digital design research. And as designers, you have a huge opportunity to go out and work with those experts to say, you need to think about the digital design platform in the same way that you do for everything else. And so having this kind of research and being able to politely push back has been really useful over the years. All right, so a few design lessons learned over the years. First, efficiency is not everything. A lot of design that I see in quote unquote the Western world is kind of like a Google. You know, it's a blank page, it's flat, it's overexposed, and there's one little bar, and then you type in something, and then there's a billion things that happen behind, and then you get a result. That's not our job in international development. Our job is to help people understand the process behind what they're doing. And so sometimes the UI does look a bit clumsy, sometimes it does look a bit redundant, but at the end of the day, we're trying to help people understand what they're doing. And so efficiency is not everything. Paper is not dead. You know, most of the world still functions mostly on paper. If you go to pretty much any country in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, even countries like Kenya that has the biggest mobile money company in the world called M-Pesa, money or paper is king. Records are still on paper, your certificates are still on paper, everything you do is not real until it's on paper. And so like the example in Burundi, often our job is to figure out how that analog process fits in with the digital, because if you don't do that, no one's paying attention. And flat can be confusing. A few years ago, I had to go return a pair of pants at the Century 21 in the financial district, for those of you who live in New York. And when I walked out of one of the side entrances to avoid all the tourists, this is what I ended up staring at. It's the new World Trade Center. And so it's not difficult to understand how something like that, with its clean lines and its metallic finish, would inspire something like this on Instagram as a design. But what happens when your entire world is this? When all you know is the colorful curved lines of Bedouin huts in Mali? Or you grew up in a mega city like New Delhi or Lagos, and when you go into the sky, you see a colorful city that goes on as far as the eye can see. Or what happens if you grew up working at the night market in Chiang Mai, Thailand? What if these are the only worlds that you know? How does this work? That's not to say that everything has to go back to a skeuomorphic design. People do understand the idea of flat in some way, but the way that we have flat design in the Western world doesn't translate to a lot of the rest of the world. And I don't have the answer of what exactly that would look like, but as a design audience, I challenge you to think about all of that. All right. Finally, some guiding principles for designing for social good. You have to have the humility and clarity to understand the difference between a market opportunity and a societal value add. Often, the only metrics that matter in the private sector are customer acquisition and retention and profit. And those are not what you're trying to design for in the world that I come from. It does not matter if you get 5 million users. If it doesn't actually add any value to the world, it doesn't matter. And honestly, putting a lot of time and thought and resources into something that may turn a big profit but may not actually help anything is not what we're here for. So identifying the difference between the two, and honestly, like, knowing that designing for the sake of designing is not what we're going for, is probably one of the most important things. I put some symbols up there. Money doesn't equal happiness. All right, this is a big one, and I have to give props to Nordic.design for understanding and acting on this point. There is no substitute for inclusion. There is not. I am one of the few females of color that go into a lot of these meetings, and a lot of times I hear the whole line of, you know, we have diversity of thought, not diversity in demographics, but that's a half-baked notion. Everybody implicitly knows that how you're treated, who you are, is largely what judges how you see the world, or at least it has an impact. And so as designers that are often leading the charge in how a product is designed or how an intervention is designed, we have the ability to push back and say, not only does it make sense from a business case perspective, but it also doesn't actually help anybody if we only get a very small bias population as part of the users or as part of the design experience. And then lastly, there are massive social good issues that are going to have to be answered later on down the line. For the first time ever, the US Census might include a question about whether somebody is LGBTQ. Every single year for the past 10 years, we've had more people die in civil wars rather than wars between nations. So the rise of populism and nationalism is killing a lot of people. And a lot of these questions fundamentally come down to the digital products that fuel the world. And so as designers, we have a huge opportunity to, again, go and find those experts that know about the society and know about the world and work with them and figure out how to elevate the voices most in need and the voices that need to be able to tell us, how do we fix this? So I would encourage all of you to think about the work that you do, maybe push your companies to do some of this more social good work, find the organizations that need your help, and if you have any questions or you want to collaborate, please feel free to reach out. I'm always available, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Completely without.
Thank you.
There we go.